The road was scorching underfoot, the air thick and heavy. Lydia supported her young daughter, walking through the intense heat, each step trembling as if she might collapse. In that desperation, the roar of a car suddenly cut through the air, marking an unexpected beginning that would change their lives forever. Summer Creek, Texas. Mid-August. The dirt road was eerily quiet, the sunlight so dense it made the cicadas' buzzing sound parched. Lydia stumbled a few more steps before kneeling, her hands pressing against the burning ground. Her breath felt like it was dragged through a steel sieve. Her lips were cracked, her throat raw. Beside her, her 6-year-old daughter, Mia, had a smudged face, sweat and tears streaking her small cheeks. Her sandals were lost somewhere near the barbed wire fence, her bare feet blistered and caked with red dust. The little girl whispered, her voice trembling, "Mommy, don't leave me alone. I'm so scared." Lydia pushed herself up, trying to pull Mia close. Her palms were burning, but she still shielded her daughter's head with her arm. She could hear Mia's rapid heartbeat thumping against her chest. The little girl didn't cry loudly or whine. Since morning, she had simply clutched her mother's shirt, one hand pressed against her stomach from hunger, the other holding on as if afraid her mother would dissolve in the sun if she let go. The road was long, their stomachs empty, their throats parched, but Mia endured silently, each step a wince swallowed back. In the moment the sun blurred before her eyes, a memory flashed. Their last argument. Thomas's voice raspy, his eyes bloodshot. "Get out of my house, both of you." "Mrs." Beatrice Langford stood on the porch, her face as cold and unglazed as pottery. The door slammed shut, the sound of the lock clicking dry and final. Lydia shook her head to clear it. She hugged her daughter's shoulders, speaking softly, as if to herself, "Mommy's right here." But her throat was so dry the words were just a breath. The sun beat down on her neck. She tried to move, but the whole world seemed to sway. Just when it felt like all hope was lost. Suddenly, the roar of an engine tore through the midday quiet. From the dusty bend appeared an old orange Ford F-150, its side caked with sand, the cabin dappled with sunlight. Esteban Ramirez was behind the wheel, his dark shirt damp with sweat, his eyes squinting against the glare. He was on his way to a delivery, his back aching, his head pounding, his whole body tired. But when he saw two figures swaying in the middle of the road, his hands gripped the steering wheel instinctively. The brakes screeched briefly. Esteban jumped out of the truck, carrying the scent of metal and hot plastic. He quickly scanned them. The mother's lips were purple, her neck veins bulging. The child's feet were blistered, her hands still clutching her mother's shirt like a small hook clinging to life. He spoke, his voice firm without a wasted breath. "You two need help. Get in the truck. This heat is no joke." Lydia recoiled slightly, her instincts flaring in her eyes, then looked at Mia. The little girl's eyes were half closed, her eyelids fluttering, her hand still clutching. Lydia nodded, a nod of exhaustion but clear. Esteban didn't ask more questions. He bent down, slipped his hands under Mia, and lifted her. The little girl was feather-light, her head slumped onto his shoulder, the smell of sweat and dust mingling with the scent of old fabric. Mia's dusty fingers still wouldn't let go of her mother's shirt, so Esteban simply supported her small hand, holding it as if it were a promise. He opened the back door and laid Mia on her side, her head resting on a rolled-up jacket. He offered his other hand to Lydia. "Careful." She took his strong arm, stepping up each rung as if climbing out of a hot well. Inside the cabin, Lydia closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the air conditioning blow cool air mixed with the smell of old plastic. Esteban pulled a towel from a storage bin, poured a little water from a plastic bottle, wrung it out quickly, and placed it on Mia's forehead. The hot skin under the towel crackled softly, and the little girl let out a tiny breath. "Drink a little," Esteban said, handing Lydia a water bottle, his voice still even. Small sips. Water flowed over the cracks in her mouth. Lydia took 2 sips, handed it back, her eyes red but dry. She turned to look at her daughter. "Mia, you're okay." The little girl didn't open her eyes, only softly smacked her lips, her hand still gripping the shirt. Esteban closed the door. He climbed into the driver's seat, shifted gears. The truck vibrated once, then rolled forward. Outside the window, the road thinned in the heat, the fence posts receding like erased lines. The sun was still intense, but it was being pushed back, becoming a long, trailing streak of light. In the rearview mirror, Esteban saw the mother leaning slightly toward her daughter, her shoulders slumping as if a heavy stone had been lifted. He didn't ask where they came from, nor did he say where they were going. The wheels simply carried all three away from the scorched earth, leaving behind the red dust, leaving behind the silence as heavy as a lid on a pot boiling dry. The orange Ford turned into the small garage yard. The roll-up door was half down, casting striped shadows on the concrete floor. The scent of oil, rubber, and cold coffee lingered. Esteban turned off the engine. The heat from the hood wafted onto his face. He opened the back door and carried Mia into the shade. The little girl's small hand gradually uncurled from her mother's shirt, her fingers leaving dusty prints. Lydia stepped down, her head still light. The smell of the garage made her feel strangely safe, like entering an old but orderly warehouse, inhabited by someone. A soft sound of footsteps. A boy appeared from behind a stack of tires. Dark, messy hair, a faded t-shirt, and eyes showing clear curiosity. "Dad?" He looked at Lydia, then at Mia, his gaze a mix of innocence and the wariness of 14. "Marcos," Esteban said, his voice low. "Get Dad a clean cup and some bread." The boy nodded, then immediately ran to fetch the items as his father instructed. Lydia wanted to say something, but her throat was dry again. Esteban gestured for her to follow him. He opened a wooden door leading to a small room at the back. A folding cot, a low wooden table, a ticking wall fan, a sink, and a fabric shelf. Light from a high window cast a thin beam. Esteban poured water into a cup, placing it in front of Lydia. "You should drink more water. You need to stay hydrated in this sun." He returned to Mia. The little girl opened her eyes, blinking because it was darker than outside. "Drink up, kiddo." Mia reached out, drank quickly but stopped as soon as she met his gaze, as if remembering his instruction. She nodded very slightly. "Thank you, sir." Marcos returned, carrying an old paper-wrapped loaf of bread. He hesitated, then rummaged in a wooden cabinet next to the cot. When he turned back, in his hand was an old teddy bear, its fur worn, its neck patched with stitches. He said nothing, only placed it next to Mia, his eyes fixed on the ceiling as if afraid of being caught feeling awkward. Mia looked at the bear, then hugged it to her chest as if holding fire. Her face relaxed, her eyelids drooping. The worn-out toy suddenly became a wall of comfort. Lydia watched the scene, her hands gripping the water cup tightly. Since morning, she had only run and endured. Now, amidst the smell of oil, her chest suddenly eased. She spoke hoarsely, trying to keep her question from trembling. "Why are you helping us?" Esteban leaned lightly against the doorframe. He looked through the blurry glass, where tires hung like silent black rings. Then he looked at Mia, his eyes touching the teddy bear, as if remembering something old. "No one should be alone in that sun. I raised a child alone too. I know the feeling." The answer was concise, promising nothing more, but it settled Lydia onto solid ground. Tears welled up, silently. She wiped them away immediately, afraid to worry her daughter, but her eyes remained wet. Mia looked at her mother, then at Esteban. The caution in the little girl's eyes receded a step. Marcos pulled the standing fan closer. "I'll leave it here," he said, his voice still breaking. Esteban just nodded. Lydia's lips moved. "Thank you, son." Marcos shrugged, as if it was nothing. But as he turned away, he glanced back at the teddy bear nestled in Mia's arms, where the old stitches had closed a tear years ago. They sat in silence for a few minutes. The cool air from the fan blew across their sunburnt skin. Esteban placed another cup of water. "There's a small bathroom in the corner," he said. "You two can use it freely." Lydia nodded. She took Mia inside, washing away the dust and sweat. The water ran steadily. The scent of soap wafted out. The red marks on Mia's feet gradually faded. Esteban stood outside, choosing a few clean pieces of fabric, spreading them on a thin mattress placed in the corner of the room. Marcos rummaged through an old bin and found a child's outfit, a faded blue t-shirt and cotton pants. "It was mine when I was little," he said, placing it on the shelf, his eyes avoiding hers. When the mother and daughter emerged, Mia wore the slightly oversized clothes, the sleeves covering most of her wrists, but clean. She hugged the teddy bear, looking down at her feet, as if she couldn't believe her feet had touched the cool floor. Lydia sighed softly. She looked around the simple room, seeing the folded blanket, the pillow that had just been fluffed, the coat hook added to the wall as if just recently. "Eat some bread, then rest," Esteban said. It wasn't a command, nor a warm invitation, just a way of arranging things. Evening shadows streamed through the crack in the door. Esteban turned off most of the garage lights, leaving a faint yellow glow emanating from the room. He stood outside, his hand on the rough iron door. The heat was subsiding. The chirping of insects began to murmur from behind the row of storage sheds. In the room, Mia's breathing became steady. Lydia pulled the blanket up to her daughter's chest, sat leaning on the edge of the mattress, her eyelids heavy. She turned her head, looking out at the doorway where Esteban stood. He wasn't looking in, but his posture was one of listening. A moment later, she lay down beside her daughter. The fan still whirred. The smell of oil mingled with the scent of soap, creating a strange peace. The warm, dim light settled on the wall, like a hand placed on a shoulder. But those moments of peace wouldn't last too long for Lydia and Mia. They would immediately face countless storms. The next morning, the fresh, young sun already pushed rising heat from the streets of Summerside. News of Esteban taking in a strange mother and daughter spread like wildfire. From the corner coffee shop to the barber shop, then to the morning market's vegetable stall. At the market, Sarah Mae Higgins, the drugstore owner, her lipstick a glaring red, stood next to a basket of green onions, her voice loud enough for the entire row of stalls to hear. Is she trying to con Esteban? She should be somewhere else, not in a man's house. Heads tilted, the rustle of wrapping paper, the words spread, needing no editing. At noon, Esteban took Lydia and Mia to Bud Wilson's general store to buy essentials. Milk, bandages, cookies. The door chime jingled. Bud stood behind the counter, his chin bristly with beard, his eyes looking through them as if through dirty glass. When he counted the change, he deliberately let a coin fall to the floor with a clink. Lydia bent to pick it up, her back stiff as a board. Bud didn't bother to apologize or meet her eyes. Esteban handed her the bag of groceries, his other hand naturally supporting Lydia's elbow. Let's go, he said. His voice wasn't loud, but enough for Bud to look up and meet his steady gaze. The church bells rang out across a corner of town. Reverend Johnson, a portly man with a purple tie, stood on the wooden pulpit, his voice echoing like striking a jar. He spoke of lost women and temptation, about avoiding darkness entering one's home. He didn't name anyone, but the pews below buzzed like wind through corn. Lydia sat in the back row, holding Mia's hand until her knuckles were white. The little girl clutched her teddy bear, her head resting against her mother's hip, utterly silent. Esteban sat slightly behind them, his shoulders straight, his eyes not avoiding any backward glances. Leaving the church, he said softly, just loud enough for the mother and daughter to hear, "Everything will be okay. We haven't done anything wrong." Lydia nodded, not fully believing, but clinging to the words like clinging to the edge of a step. In the afternoon, when they returned to the garage, a black pickup truck was parked blocking the entrance. Thomas Harper leaned against the hood, his tie askew, his eyes blazing as if he'd missed many nights of sleep. Behind him, Beatrice Langford wore a pastel dress, her hair perfect, a half smile like a thin cut. The sun cast their long shadows onto the concrete, straight and cold. Thomas stepped forward, without greeting, without looking at Mia. "I'm here to get my wife and child," he snarled. "Hand them over, Esteban." He emphasized each word, "hand them over," as if reading a court order. Beatrice stood slightly behind him, her voice even as if stating an old rule. "This isn't your business, Esteban. That girl is my granddaughter. She isn't capable of caring for her." Mia clung to her mother's leg, the teddy bear crushed in her hand. Lydia heard the slam of the old door lock again, as if it had just happened. She pressed her lips together, not backing down, but her breath scraped against her raw throat. Esteban took a step forward, placing himself between them and the doorway. His eyes were partially closed, as if shielding against the blinding sun. His voice was cold, flat as a steel ruler. "They are not objects to be handed over, and as long as they need it, I will protect them." The air thickened. Thomas scoffed, a joyless laugh. "You want to go against this whole town?" He spoke close to Esteban's face, his breath smelling of stale coffee. "You have no idea what you're getting into. You're stupid." "I'm smart enough to know what I'm doing," Esteban replied. He didn't touch Thomas, but his silence made the space between them a wall. Beatrice gently pulled Thomas's sleeve. "Let's go," she said, still smiling. "We have other ways." She swept her eyes over Lydia, a look that measured an object, then turned her back. Thomas yanked the car door open, the screeching sound harsh. The black pickup backed out, its tires grinding on the gravel like scattered seeds. The engine noise faded. In the yard, the wind brought back the smell of oil. Lydia turned to Esteban, her eyes filled with apology. I've pulled you into trouble." Esteban shook his head concisely. "It's not your fault." He bent down to Mia. "You okay, kiddo?" The little girl nodded, her lips pressed together, clutching the bear until its fur was matted. From the street, a few townspeople walked by, glancing into the yard as if at a car accident. The murmurs rose again, low but thick. They closed the garage door. Inside, the dim yellow light came on, gathering into a small, warm circle. The pressure from outside felt like rising water around thin walls. Lydia placed her hand on her daughter's shoulder. Esteban leaned against the doorframe. No one said anything more, but everyone understood. The wave of rumors now had a flag and a commander, and from here, it would only get higher. A few days later, Esteban's garage had a new rhythm. In the mornings, Lydia cleaned the workbench, wiped oil from door handles, and rehung wrenches that were out of line. At noon, she cooked a simple pot of beans on the hot plate, checking Mia's foot bandages. In the afternoons, she swept the concrete yard, gathering dust into a neat straight line. Esteban worked on engines, speaking little. Marcos arranged tires, occasionally kicking a worn ball into a corner where Mia sat playing. The little girl was used to it, but still asked for nothing. When offered water, she nodded. When given a piece of bread, she whispered, "Thank you," then hugged her bear and sat still. That evening, Esteban simmered a thin soup, the smell of dried onion and black pepper mingling. Mia took a stubby pencil, fiddling with it on an old piece of cardboard. She drew a crooked square house, next to it a long-haired mother, a boy wearing a cap, and a tall man bending over a car. When she finished, she carried the drawing to Esteban. She said nothing, just smiled softly, her eyes closing into crescent moons. Esteban took it, admired it for a few seconds, then carefully taped it to the wall with masking tape, between an old calendar and an unripped invoice. "Leave it here," he said, his voice lower than usual. Then suddenly, the sound of an unfamiliar car stopped in the yard. A tall man, wearing a thin jacket, stepped out. His face was sharp, his eyes observing quickly as if measuring the room before entering. He held up a card. "I'm Finn Carter, an investigative journalist from Boston. I'm following the Langford family, and I think your story might be related to what I'm looking for." The atmosphere shifted. Esteban pulled out a chair. "Please, have a seat." Lydia placed another glass of water. Marcos stood pressed against the tire rack, silent. Finn opened his notebook, not pressing record. "Please tell me from the beginning." Esteban spoke first, in short segments, without embellishment. Meeting Lydia and Mia in the sun, the rumors in the market, Sunday's sermon. He paused for a moment, as if deciding whether to tell the next part. Then he said, "After my wife passed, I signed a stack of papers to renew my land taxes. The Langford family's company helped me. 6 months later, I lost the land. My lawyer said the contract was valid. I was lucky to keep this garage." Finn didn't react with emotion, just wrote, "What was the name of that company?" Esteban read it slowly. Finn drew a line under the name. Lydia clasped her hands, her eyes on the child who was engrossed in looking at the drawing on the wall. Esteban nodded slightly, as if saying, "It's okay." She took a breath. "Thomas controlled everything. Where I went, who I met, how I spent money. If I said one wrong thing, he'd slam the door. When I argued back, he'd pin my arm against the wall." She paused. Beatrice always took his side. She told me I needed to look at myself, that the child belonged to their family. Her voice was hoarse but steady. The fear was evident in her word choice, not in any bruises. Finn looked up, a cold flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. "It seems I was right. This isn't just a family matter. The Langford family has been seizing land in this area for years, based on fine print in contracts and tax debts. They target the vulnerable, those who have just suffered a loss. If we want to expose them, we need undeniable proof. Original documents, testimonies, tax record cross-referencing, and at least 2 independent witnesses." Marcos shifted his feet slightly, the soles of his shoes scraping the floor. Esteban clasped his hands, looking directly. "What do you need from us?" "The truth," Finn replied. "And courage. I'll contact Mrs. Agnes Dubois. She used to work at the land registry office, and Paul Miller, who lost his farm 3 years ago. If their stories match the records, we have a path forward. Lydia looked at Esteban. Mia had fallen asleep on the chair, her head leaning against the back, her hand still clutching the bear. The small room was so quiet you could hear the fan ticking. Lydia stroked her daughter's hair, then looked up. Her eyes no longer ran away. "I'll speak. I won't let them harm her anymore." Esteban nodded, as concise as tying a knot. "We will cooperate." Finn closed his notebook. "Good. I'm staying at a motel outside town tonight. Tomorrow I'll be back with a to-do list and a trustworthy lawyer. Don't go out alone. If anyone causes trouble, call me or call the police, though I know they usually side with the powerful." Esteban walked him to the door. Finn's shadow lengthened on the concrete yard, then shrank as he got into his car. The red taillights receded from the roll-up door. Lydia stood in the doorway, holding an empty cup, her eyes fixed on the drawing on the wall. Finn began his work diligently. Early in the morning, he parked his car in the old neighborhood near the ditch, where Mrs. Agnes Dubois lived alone. She opened the door in a worn sweater, her eyes bright and alert. On the kitchen table were a tin box of index cards, a few hospital bills, and a dog-eared notebook. "Beatrice's son took his wife to the emergency room 3 times in 2 years, she said softly, pushing hospital admission confirmations with Lydia's name towards Finn. "No need to read the details. Enough to see he's not a gentleman." She poured tea. "The Langfords take land from naive old folks. They send people to talk about tax debts, offer help with loans, then change the terms. By the time people realize, they've already signed, and it's too late." Finn recorded every date, every address. His pen glided but missed nothing. In the afternoon, at the parking lot behind the church, Paul Miller arrived. His hands were calloused, his nails stained with oil, his jacket thick. "Esteban is a man of his word," Paul said, placing his heavy hand on Finn's car hood as if driving a nail. "Even after his wife passed, he still took his kid to school on time, paid his debts on time, never argued in public. That garage is the fruit of his hard work." Finn nodded, adding another mark under dedicated. Most surprisingly, Finn O'Malley, the red-haired mail carrier with worn-down shoes, pulled him into a narrow alley behind the post office. "I saw them many times," Finn said quietly. Thomas and Beatrice met behind the old movie theater, at irregular times. They'd hand over envelopes, talk for about 10 minutes, then disperse. They always looked around before touching the envelopes. He handed Finn copies of 2 local money orders signed by a Langford assistant. As night fell, Finn changed his approach. He knew Beatrice always carried an old fountain pen, a gift from her late husband, as she often told. During a social visit to Sarah May's drugstore, Finn pretended to be a customer, giving the pen to Beatrice to look at. "It's leaking ink." He returned it after 5 minutes of fixing the seal in the back room, which smelled of iodine alcohol. Inside, a tiny, pea-sized recording chip lay still as a whisper. 2 days later, late at night, in the old movie theater parking lot, Finn sat in his car, his hand ready on the noise filter button. Voices cut through the metal, as clear as if someone was whispering in his ear. Beatrice's voice, cold and thin. "We can't let her stay there any longer. That child, Mia, must be ours, not hers to ruin." Thomas snorted, his voice raspy. "We'll make her look like she's an unfit mother. The town will believe it if we repeat it often enough. Once Mia is with us, we'll handle the other problems, and that Esteban Ramirez is just an annoyance." Finn listened to everything, without sudden celebration. He turned off the device, removed the memory card, and put it in his inside jacket pocket like a mud-covered gem. The next afternoon, at the garage, Esteban closed the roll-up door and turned on a small speaker. Lydia stood by the table, clutching a glass of water. Marcos leaned against the tire rack, his eyes unblinking. Beatrice's voice echoed in the room, so cold it seemed to crack the light bulbs. Then Thomas's voice, steady as someone who had thought it all through. Lydia paled. They planned all of it," she whispered, her voice trembling. A terrible feeling spread from her chest to her knees, making her clutch the chair. Esteban turned off the speaker, not letting the sound linger on the walls longer than necessary. "We have something they didn't expect," he said. Finn placed the memory card in a plastic box, labeling it with a marker. Source 1, Old Theater. Just then, a knock sounded. A man in a gray suit walked in, his tie straight, his shoes clean despite the oil stains in the yard. "Lydia Harper?" His voice was neutral, like reading a specification. Lydia stepped forward. A thick envelope, sharp, edged, sliced her hand. The man nodded, leaving without looking back. Lydia opened it. A court summons. Thomas Harper and Beatrice Langford were suing for custody of Mia. Date, 3 weeks from now. The room sagged as if after a lightning strike. Lydia stood still, her hands trembling. Esteban gently took the envelope, placed it on the table, smoothing the paper's edge as if smoothing a wrinkle on a forehead. He looked directly into Lydia's eyes. Then we don't run anymore. Never again. He turned to Finn. What do we have? Finn had already pulled a stack of yellow papers from his briefcase. We have hospital records referenced with timelines. Paul's testimony about character, Finn O'Malley's testimony about secret meetings, and this recording. Now we need to extract clean audio, verify the pen's origin, and find another link at the land registry office. The wall must be so strong they can't climb over it. The yellow light on the table flickered slightly. Esteban spread out the pieces. The memory card, the money orders, copies of hospital confirmations, the list of tax debts Agnes had marked. Finn added his notebook, clipping his pen. Marcos took tape, labeling each plastic bag, as carefully as labeling medicine bottles. In the next room, Mia slept soundly, her breathing peaceful. Lydia carried her daughter, pulling the blanket up to her chin, then sat on the edge of the bed, her hand on the small chest feeling the steady heartbeat. She looked through the crack in the door. 2 men bent over the table, the lamplight falling on their hands as if covering them with a layer of determination. She knew the real battle had begun, but this time she wasn't alone. 3 fateful weeks that would decide the lives of the mother and daughter. Every morning, Lydia opened her eyes to see the court envelope on the corner of the table. She folded clothes, swept the yard, and made milk for Mia at a steady rhythm. But her hand sometimes paused on the doorknob. Mia didn't ask, only often stopped her pencil to look towards the exit as if listening for a brake sound. The little girl drew more. Finn was busy, coming and going like a shadow. He changed seats in the corner coffee shop, writing names in his notebook that sounded as bland as plain water. At Helen's hair salon, blow-dryer's word, the scent of hair dye sweet and sharp. Helen Chen, 40 years old, with a kind face carefully parted a client's hair with a comb. Finn waited until the blow-dryer stopped before speaking softly. I need what you've heard. Not gossip. The truth about Beatrice and Thomas. Helen glanced at the mirror. I just do hair. You do hair for many people, Finn replied, his voice even. And you've been in Summerside long enough to distinguish between gossip and honest confessions. That evening, Esteban came. He didn't pressure her. He just sat in the waiting chair, talking about the time Lydia fainted in the sun, about how Mia hugged the old bear and slept through the night. Helen was silent for a long time, then put down her scissors. These details had touched her compassion. She used to come here to get her hair done before every meeting, Helen said, her eyes still on the section of hair in her hand. She called Lydia a burden, said the child belongs to the Langfords. And Thomas. He once sat right there, telling Bud that he had kicked her out to teach her a lesson. I don't like getting involved in other people's business. You're afraid of them, Finn said. Yes. Esteban stood up. If you speak, you won't be alone. Helen nodded very slightly. I'll say what I heard, exactly as it was. She pulled a small curtain, wrote her available hours on a piece of paper and handed it to Finn. On the paper, the blue ink trembled slightly. The next morning, Finn drove to the edge of town, where Mr. Joe's wooden house nestled behind a row of eucalyptus trees. Mr. Joe, 75, with a hunched back and sharp eyes, greeted him with a nod. I worked for the Langfords for 30 years, he said. Until I asked about the property line, then I was fired. He pointed to a pencil mark drawn diagonally across the ditch. They moved it an inch, then another inch. When old folks wanted to sell, they inflated the tax debt calculations. Finn scanned each document with a handheld scanner. Mr. Joe lifted an old water pump from the corner of the house, tapping it. Esteban fixed this for me during the dry season. Didn't charge me. A man like that can't be bad. He handed over an additional shipping invoice with a recipient's signature that was Beatrice's assistant. Take it. When you live to this age, people fear losing face more than losing money. News of Finn digging around reached the Langfords quickly. Beatrice's smile changed. Fewer teeth, more coldness. Sarah May at the drugstore spoke louder than usual. Watch out for outsiders stirring things up. Bud Wilson stacked milk cans on the counter like soldiers, looking up to throw out a comment. Don't let that reporter turn Summerside into a dump. A few strange men in suits circled the garage in the evenings, then left when Esteban turned on the headlights. Lydia heard all these scattered bits of news. She stood at the door of the small room, watching Finn spread out papers, watching Esteban mark each audio clip, watching Marcos label file bags with painstakingly neat handwriting. If they threaten Helen, and Mr. Joe is old, she said, trailing off. The truth has its own weight, Esteban replied, his warm hand resting on her cold one. And so do you, Lydia. You've been through the worst already. She nodded once. No promises, no vows, just a deep breath. Mia didn't understand the words in the files, but she understood the atmosphere. The little girl sat on the floor drawing thick clouds. In each cloud she put names. Miss Helen, Mr. Joe, Mr. Finn Mailman. Words misspelled, lines scribbled, but the smiles were drawn correctly. By the end of the week, Finn had a substantial collection of testimonies. Tomorrow, he said, I'll take this package to the lawyer. We'll request a subpoena for land registry documents. The rest is about keeping everyone safe until the trial. The Summerside County courtroom was as cold as a hushed whisper. The wooden benches gleamed from countless people waiting their turn. On one side, Thomas Harper leaned back, his tie tight, his eyes arrogant. Beatrice Langford adjusted her gloves, her lips pressed into a thin line. Beside them, lawyer Martin Davis smoothed a thick file, his self-satisfied smile as sharp as the click of a pen. On the other side, Lydia sat next to Esteban Ramirez, her back straight, her hands clasped to keep them from trembling. Finn Carter sat in the back row, his briefcase across his lap. When Judge Ramirez entered, the simultaneous rising of everyone sounded like a wooden wave. Martin Davis launched his attack from the opening. His voice was smooth. Defendant Lydia Harper is an unstable mother, neglectful of her child, and dependent. And Mr. Ramirez, an instigating outsider, is exploiting this family's turmoil. He called Thomas to the stand. Thomas leaned into the microphone, speaking as if reading from a script. She was lazy, neglected the house. Once, he paused, looking up at the jury, drank until she forgot about her child. Beatrice followed, her gaze cold. I tried to help, but she always refused. A deserving mother doesn't behave like that. Lydia stood up when it was her turn. She didn't search for flowery words. I left the house because I was scared, she said, her voice hoarse but steady. Scared for Mia. Every day I counted her breaths, waiting until the sound of the door no longer slammed. She placed a photo of Mia at the garage on the table, her cheeks flushed, the blisters on her feet healed. This is the journal I kept since being at Mr. Ramirez's place. Meal times, medicine, sleep times. She presented Mrs. Agnes Dubois' confirmation papers. Weight, blood pressure, signs of improvement. No blame, no complaints. She simply narrated, as if laying down stones to cross a muddy patch. Finn Carter was called. He took the oath, opened his briefcase. I am an investigative journalist. I followed the Langford family in a land fraud case. He presented a USB drive. The court clerk turned on the machine. Beatrice's voice echoed, clear and cold. We can't let her stay there any longer. That child, Mia, must be ours. Then Thomas's voice. We'll make her look like she's an unfit mother. Esteban Ramirez is just an annoyance. In the absolute silence, Martin Davis shifted his pen, glancing at his clients. Finn continued. Mr. Joe's hand-drawn property line map, old receipts, money orders with Langford assistants' signatures, the timeline of Lydia's hospital visits provided by Agnes. He didn't raise his voice. Each paper was placed down like a wedge driven into decaying wood. Martin Davis counterattacked, calling Sarah Mae Higgins and Bud Wilson. Sarah stood, clutching her purse, speaking up. I saw Lydia. She didn't know how to take care of her child. Bud added a few bitter words. Martin nodded. As you hear, the community all... Objection. Lydia's lawyer stood up, but Finn had already raised his hand to add. The judge nodded. Finn flipped open a new folder. These are copies of 2 cash transfer orders and 2 local money orders. Sender, Thomas Harper. Recipients, Sarah Mae Higgins and Bud Wilson. Along with the testimony of Finn O'Malley, the mail carrier, about delivering these envelopes just before the rumors spread. He held out copies of the signed receipts. Sarah's face briefly turned white. Bud looked down at his shoes as if searching for a stain to blame. The judge accepted the documents, lightly tapping the gavel. The two previous witnesses are temporarily withdrawn from the list. The court will consider perjury charges if necessary. Helen Chen stepped up with her apron hastily folded in a bag. I do hair for many people, she said, looking straight ahead. Mrs. Beatrice often called Lydia a burden, saying the child belongs to the Langfords. Thomas once boasted that he had kicked her out to teach her a lesson. I was scared, but the truth is still the truth. Mr. Joe walked forward, leaning on his cane. I used to manage the Langford farm. They shifted the property line inch by inch. This, he pointed to a faded pencil mark, is the ditch that was redrawn. They took from the Ramirez family after his wife passed away. His old voice resonated, each word sinking into the floor. Then it was Esteban's turn. He placed his calloused hands on the edge of the stand, needing no papers. I found them at midday, in the sun. Lydia was carrying the little girl, walking until she collapsed. At the garage, she woke up before me every morning, recording Mia's water intake every hour. I don't know all of her past. I only know she is a mother. He paused, lowering his voice, as if afraid of disturbing us sleep in the next room. She taught Mia how to survive without complaining. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the ceiling fan. Martin Davis flipped through his file, then flipped back, but had no more questions to fill the newly opened gap. Judge Ramirez looked from one side to the other, his gaze speaking for no one. He asked the clerk to number the evidence and requested the judicial police to seize the audio recording and land documents to transfer to the prosecutor for consideration of other potential crimes. Thomas's face lost its confident color. Beatrice, for the first time, pulled at her gloves, her bare hands revealing taut knuckles. Finn sat still, his pen clipped behind his ear. Lydia didn't breathe any harder, just gripped her hands under the wooden table. Esteban nodded very slightly, as if tightening a final screw. The court is recessed for deliberation, the judge said, striking the gavel. Before anyone could stand, two police officers left their positions, walking slowly down the aisle, heading straight for Thomas Harper and Beatrice Langford's seats. The metallic gleam of handcuffs flashed a thin line. No one spoke. The air hung by a thread about to break. The court reconvened. Judge Ramirez struck the gavel 3 times. The noise settled like dust after a gust of wind. Order. He waited until the courtroom was silent except for the fan. He opened the file, his voice solemn. Based on testimony, physical evidence, and valid audio recordings, the court rules: 1. Mr. Thomas Harper's custody and visitation rights for minor Mia Harper are hereby completely revoked. 2. Full custody and decision-making authority over minor Mia Harper are granted to her biological mother, Miss Lydia Harper. 3. The court recognizes Mr. Esteban Ramirez as the legal stepfather of minor Mia Harper, based on his petition for guardianship and evidence of his actual caregiving role. Additionally, the court acknowledges his humane actions and Miss Lydia's courage in protecting the child. 4. Regarding properties seized through fraudulent means, including the land that belonged to Mr. Ramirez's family, the court orders their return or appropriate compensation based on independent appraisal. The related files concerning land fraud and welfare fund embezzlement are hereby transferred to the prosecutor for separate criminal proceedings. The gavel struck down, a heavy yet clear sound. Lydia sprang up as if a tight band had been removed from her chest. She brought her hand to her mouth, but a sob escaped anyway. Esteban gripped her hand under the table, a firm, understated squeeze. Finn in the back lowered his pen from behind his ear, bowing his head slightly as if acknowledging the role of many more people than just himself. Police led Thomas away. He looked back, his mouth moving in silent words. Beatrice walked straight, her neck stiff as a wooden post, white gloves stained with gray where the handcuffs had been. The door closed, the click of the latch echoing briefly. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun slanted through the trees. There were no more furtive glances like before. Mrs. Agnes was already standing on the steps, holding a cloth bag, her eyes moist. "Where's the little one?" she asked. And just then Paul Miller carried Mia from the parking lot. "Mommy!" Mia reached out her arms. Lydia opened her arms to embrace her, holding her tight. The smell of cheap soap and children's sweat hit her chest, simple and real. Esteban stood beside them, his hand still on Lydia's back, as if afraid she might sway in another gust of wind. Helen squeezed in, forgetting the hair clip behind her ear. I spoke up. She spoke as if explaining herself to the town. Joe came with his cane, offering a trembling but firm hand. "It's time, girl. Finn O'Malley stood behind, giving a nod that said everything. Mia turned to Esteban, her dark eyes wide. Perhaps the little girl sensed that something had changed. The steps today suddenly didn't feel as steep. "Daddy!" she chirped suddenly, without anyone teaching her, hugging his neck tightly. The word "daddy" fell onto the warm concrete, breaking into a sound that made everyone look up and smile. Esteban hugged the little girl tight, his eyes blinking slowly, as if allowing himself to believe. Lydia placed her hand on his shoulder. Few words were needed. The days of harsh sun, red dust, the nights listening for the sound of a truck stopping outside, all condensed into a thin line, then floated away. Finn stepped over, handing Lydia a thin envelope. "Copy of the temporary order. The original will be mailed later." He looked at the group, lowering his voice. "This story isn't just a case, but today, the most important part is done." Paul gently clapped Esteban on the shoulder. "That land," he said, "we'll remeasure the boundary. I'll call my nephew, the surveyor. We'll get it right." On the steps, Mrs. Agnes stroked Mia's messy hair. "Have something to eat," she smiled. "You two look like you live on air." Helen offered a paper bag. "Waffles and butter candy." "Mr. Joe talked about the old water pump leaking again." Esteban nodded. "I'll come by tomorrow." Everything returned to small matters, and precisely because they were small, they were solid. The wind carried the smell of dry leaves and warm asphalt. Finn looked up at the courthouse roof, his hands in his pockets. He didn't raise his camera, didn't record. This moment didn't need to be saved on tape. He just watched how Lydia bent low to hear Mia whisper, how Esteban slowly nodded when someone congratulated him, and how the town accustomed to malicious whispers was learning how to say normal things again. As they walked down the steps, the sun touched the edge of the tree canopy, casting a thin light on their shoulders. There were no more judging eyes lurking behind curtains. The shop windows reflected 4 figures: the man holding the child's hand, the woman clutching the court order under her arm, friends standing around them. They walked in an unhurried line, as if afraid of spilling the piece that had just been poured out. A few weeks after the trial, life at the garage returned to the steady hum of an engine. In the mornings, sunlight skimmed across the wooden workbench, lingering on the new calendar. The phone rang with a rhythm. People scheduled brake replacements, wheel alignments. In the backyard, the soil was soft, the wooden fence repainted. News about Thomas and Beatrice awaiting trial remained quietly in the newspaper, no longer weighing on anyone's chest. The seized lands had begun the process of being returned. The boundary maps hanging in the town office had new layers of paper. Mia went to school regularly. She carried a backpack with a teddy bear patch, and every afternoon she ran into the yard, telling stories about her teacher to the tomato plants. Her cheeks had regained their rosy color. Marcos met her at the gate, carrying her pencil case, making her laugh with simple games from their shared yard, blowing into bottles, tossing can lids. Lydia watched the scene, her hands still washing wrenches, a slight curve to her mouth. They got married on a calm afternoon. The backyard was strung with lights, each bulb adorned with a wild daisy. Esteban himself wove a wreath from willow branches and wildflowers picked from the ditch. Coarse twine tied the knot at the joint. Lydia wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Agnes helped alter, and Helen Chen did her hair, a low bun, adorned with a dull pearl clip. Mrs. Agnes brought trays of traditional pastries, the smell of butter and cinnamon wafting through every corner of the garden. Mia wore a white dress, barefoot on the grass, twirling her skirt to see the fishtail lace. Marcos pinned a sprig of rosemary to Esteban's lapel, took a sniff, and smiled. "Smells like Mom's cooking." Friends stood around. Paul Miller arrived early, setting up 2 loose folding chairs. Mr. Joe walked slowly, his old jacket neat but uncreased, a rare smile deepening the wrinkles around his eyes. Finn Carter appeared without his briefcase, holding a bouquet of wildflowers tied with twine. Even those who had once whispered came. They stood respectfully at the back of the garden, some offering apologies, others saying nothing, just shaking hands firmly. The old pastor from the small chapel read a few short verses. Esteban looked at Lydia, his eyes sealing a promise that had stretched since that scorching day. "I will be your support," he said, his voice not loud. "I will be a good father to Mia." Lydia nodded softly, her eyes bright but not breaking. "Thank you for opening your door," she replied, "for giving me a home I never dared to dream of." Mia stood in the middle, looking back and forth, then took their hands and pulled them close together. A gentle ripple of applause rose, like grass swaying. After the ceremony, everyone ate cake and drank coffee from paper cups. Finn placed his bouquet on the table, then went to the back to help Esteban take a family photo in front of a canvas tarp. "This time I'm here as a friend," he said, shoulder to shoulder with Esteban. Helen leaned in to whisper to Lydia, "Your hair held up all day." "Mister." Joe pulled a chair close to Mia, pointing to the drawn water pump at the edge of her picture. "You drew the valve just right." The little girl giggled, showing her missing teeth. In the days that followed, the garage became busier. The appointment book was filled for Mondays and Tuesdays. Esteban added more tool shelves, bought a new diagnostic machine. Marcos took on odd jobs, writing invoices, running to get parts. Paul referred more customers. People trusted him more after the trial, not because they suddenly understood mechanics, but because they knew this mechanic would stand firm in a storm. Lydia no longer just cooked and cleaned. She set up an old wooden table in the corner of the garage. Hanging a hand-painted sign, Marcos painted the letters. Mia glued tiny heart labels. Summerside Healing Hub. Below it was a small line. "Come and talk." Every Thursday afternoon, a few people stopped by. A widow brought her broken toaster. A young man brought a flickering desk lamp. An older gentleman needed someone to listen to his old debt story. Lydia taught people how to change fuses, how to splice wires, how to budget grocery money to avoid coming up short. More importantly, she poured tea, sat down, and let people talk. Those who had been oppressed by the Langfords found a place in that small corner to tell their stories without fear of being contradicted. Finn occasionally dropped by with flyers about free legal services. Helen brought a box of safety pins and small scissors for the quick fix corner. Mrs. Agnes gathered a basket of notebooks, telling people to take what they needed. Mr. Joe brought an old map, asking Esteban to frame it and hang it. The newly redrawn property lines, old but straight pencil marks. On the wall next to the map was Mia's drawing. The crooked house. 4 people under a sky with many named clouds. In the evenings, Lydia taught Mia her homework. Marcos sat opposite doing math. Esteban worked at the next table, adjusting a carburetor, occasionally looking up. 2-minute eye break, Captain. Mia put down her pencil, rested her chin on her hand, closing one eye to look at Dad through the breeze. The old teddy bear sat neatly on the shelf, its neck still with the old stitches, like a gentle witness to a different path. One day, it rained unexpectedly. Water washed away the dust from the road, flowing into channels under the trucks. Lydia opened the garage door halfway, letting the fine rain drift in to cool the air, making the metallic smell less sharp. People took shelter from the rain, sitting crowded on the long bench. Someone talked about the harvest. Someone asked how to retrieve documents. No one mentioned the old malicious whispers anymore. The town learned to speak normal sentences, then learned to say thank you. The backyard garden grew. Esteban added more stakes. Mia sowed morning glory seeds. Marcos built birdhouses and hung them on the edge of the tin roof. Lydia watered the plants, water spraying in droplets on the leaves. The sound of engines in the garage blended with the chirping of birds, creating a simple but sufficient soundtrack. On Saturday evening, they lit the grill. Paul brought some corn, Helen brought a salad, Finn carried a cooler of lemonade. Mr. Joe told an old story repeatedly, then fell asleep in his chair, a smile still on his face. String lights cast their glow on faces that had been through the scorching summer. Esteban clapped his hands, calling everyone for a photo. The printed photo was taped to the wall next to the Healing Hub sign. Below it, Lydia wrote with a marker, "Here, the door is always open." As night fell, the wind carried the scent of damp earth into the small room. Lydia folded blankets, turned off the light. She paused at the doorway, looking out at the yard where the wedding wreath still hung, dried but holding its shape. Esteban walked by, gently touching her back. Mia was asleep, hugging her bear, breathing steadily. Marcos pulled the curtain, wished them good night, then closed the door. The garage fell silent, as after a beautiful piece of music. No fireworks, no trumpets. Just the rustle of leaves, the ticking of the clock, and the familiar breathing of those living under one roof. A family that had been made whole again. A town learning to stand with each other. This symphony of peace was not loud, but everyone within it heard it clearly. A few years passed like chalk marks on concrete, then swept away by a broom. A new sign hung on the tin roof. Ramirez Auto Repair. Below it, a small line added, painted cream. Summerside Healing Hub. The garage expanded by another bay, tool shelves arranged by color code. Every Saturday morning, Esteban would pull up the roll-up door, his voice steady. Basic auto repair class starts now. Older folks carried thermoses. Little kids clutched screwdrivers like pencils. He taught them how to change spark plugs, how to tell the difference between engine knocks, then moved on to home stuff. Light switches, fuses, squeaky hinges. No one paid. Those who could afford it left a bunch of vegetables or a homemade pie. Mia was now 11, her hair braided, her eyes sharp as a ray of sun through a glass. She stood at the hub table, writing down customers' names, pouring lemonade, asking, "Do you need us to listen, or do you need to borrow pliers?" She always knew when to be silent. Marcos was now as tall as Esteban, his hands more calloused, his shirt always stained with oil. He worked like a man who still held the smile of a boy lifting engines, installing tires, occasionally secretly drawing stars on warranty cards to make them less dry. Summerside changed a lot. At the coffee shop, people spoke more softly when mentioning someone not present. Many sentences began with, "Let me try to help." Sarah May occasionally visited the hub, leaving a box of bandages, not looking too long into Lydia's eyes but pausing long enough to say, "I'm sorry." Bud Wilson stood at the door, for the first time shaking Esteban's hand gruffly. "You're good at your job." Helen Chen came on her free afternoons, teaching women how to cut hair not badly in 10 minutes. Mr. Joe brought the new boundary map, sitting and telling stories about the old ditch that had been restored to its proper name. One hot afternoon, the ceiling fan whirring, Lydia was showing a young boy how to replace a washing machine belt when a middle-aged woman walked in. Her jacket was thin, her shoulders slumped, her eyes deeply shadowed as if from long-term sleep deprivation. She stood at the doorway for a moment, then spoke softly. "I'm Ruth Thomas's distant relative." The atmosphere in the room paused for a beat, then flowed on. Lydia put down the pliers. "Please, have a seat." "I came to apologize," Ruth said, her hands clasped. "Thomas once helped me with money when my mother was sick. Later, I found out it was dirty money. Since he was arrested, I've been barely getting by. I was afraid to come here, but I didn't know who else to ask." Lydia poured water, pushing the glass towards her. "Tell me about it." Ruth talked about debt, about her rented room, about not daring to look her neighbors in the eye. No one interrupted. When she fell silent, Lydia said, "I once didn't know who to ask. The hardest part is walking through the door. You just did that." Esteban walked over, his hands still stained with oil. "Your dryer has a bad bearing. I'll come take a look tonight. And for the debt, Finn has a friend at a free legal aid center. I'll give you their number." Ruth nodded, tears catching in her lower eyelids. "Aren't you angry?" Lydia shook her head gently. "Being angry doesn't fix anything. We do what we can." Mia brought out a piece of paper. "Do you like planting flowers? We have morning glory seeds. They grow easily this season." Ruth smiled, a smile as if remembering she still had teeth. She took the small bag of seeds, holding it the way someone holds a piece of sunshine. In the evening, the repair class ended with laughter. An old man tested a bicycle he'd fixed, braking to a screeching halt right at the door. The kids howled. Esteban reminded them, "Always test the brakes twice." Marcos shortened the string lights. Mia locked the tape box. Lydia wiped down the table, placing a small wooden sign on it. "Everyone has a place here." Someone asked Esteban why he didn't charge for his classes. He shrugged. "I've been given too much." The questioner laughed. "You're the pillar of this town now." Esteban shook his head. "Number. Each person is a brick. I'm just the mortar." Marcos grew another inch, his hands now skilled. He said he would continue his studies to get certified, then stay at the garage. Mia wrote an article for the school newspaper, "How to Change a Washing Machine Belt and How to Listen." The second article was short, with one sentence. "Listen until the other person no longer shrugs their shoulders." Lydia hung the article next to their wedding photo, the wildflowers still holding their shape in the glass frame. A summer afternoon, the ceiling fan whirring. Lydia was guiding a boy on changing a washing machine belt when a middle-aged woman walked in. Her jacket was thin, her shoulders slumped, her eyes deeply shadowed as if from long-term sleep deprivation. She stood at the doorway for a moment, then spoke softly. "I'm Ruth Thomas's distant relative." The atmosphere in the room paused for a beat, then flowed on. Lydia put down the pliers. "Please, have a seat." "I came to apologize," Ruth said, her hands clasped. Thomas once helped me with money when my mother was sick. Later, I found out it was dirty money. Since he was arrested, I've been barely getting by. I was afraid to come here, but I didn't know who else to ask. Lydia poured water, pushing the glass towards her. Tell me about it. Ruth talked about debt, about her rented room, about not daring to look her neighbors in the eye. No one interrupted. When she fell silent, Lydia said, I once didn't know who to ask. The hardest part is walking through the door. You just did that. Esteban walked over, his hands still stained with oil. Your dryer has a bad bearing. I'll come take a look tonight. And for the debt, Finn has a friend at a free legal aid center. I'll give you their number. Ruth nodded, tears catching in her lower eyelids. Aren't you angry? Lydia shook her head gently. Being angry doesn't fix anything. We do what we can. Mia brought out a piece of paper. Do you like planting flowers? We have morning glory seeds. They grow easily this season. Ruth smiled, a smile as if remembering she still had teeth. She took the small bag of seeds, holding it the way someone holds a piece of sunshine. In the evening, the repair class ended with laughter. An old man tested a bicycle he'd fixed, braking to a screeching halt right at the door. The kids howled. Esteban reminded them, always test the brakes twice. Marco shortened the string lights. Mia locked the tape box. Lydia wiped down the table, placing a small wooden sign on it. Everyone has a place here. Someone asked Esteban why he didn't charge for his classes. He shrugged. I've been given too much. The questioner laughed. You're the pillar of this town now. Esteban shook his head. Number. Each person is a brick. I'm just the mortar. Marcos grew another inch, his hands now skilled. He said he would continue his studies to get certified, then stay at the garage. Mia wrote an article for the school newspaper. How to change a washing machine belt, and how to listen. The second article was short, with one sentence, listen until the other person no longer shrugs their shoulders. Lydia hung the article next to their wedding photo, the wildflowers still holding their shape in the glass frame. A summer afternoon, wind blowing through the morning glories in the backyard. Esteban hung a wooden swing under the porch beam, the rope braided from 3 strands. Marcos tied the knot hidden on the back. After dinner, they pulled chairs out onto the porch. Mia sat in the middle, her feet dangling, telling Esteban about her teacher. Marcos joked, slow down so the mechanic can understand. Lydia leaned her shoulder against Esteban's, smelling the mix of engine oil and lemon soap, the scent that had become home. The warm light from the healing hub shone out, a golden blanket spread over the grass. Esteban looked across the yard, seeing the shadows of people who once walked in with heavy shoulders now walking out lighter. He turned to Lydia. Okay? Okay, she replied without thinking. Mia giggled as Marcos's story veered into a comedic play. The laughter echoed off the tin roof and fell like cool rain. Esteban looked at his children, at the woman who had brought breath back into this home. He thought about that sun-scorched dirt road from years ago, a hot streak that was now a smooth memory. Family, he understood, wasn't walls and a roof. It was the space between people sitting next to each other without needing to speak loudly. It was a promise kept through many seasons. Inside the house, the clock struck 10. On the porch, insects chirped. The Summerside Healing Hub light was still on, not glaring. Just enough for anyone passing by to know someone was awake and waiting. A small lighthouse, for hearts that needed a shore. And if someone new were to push the door open tomorrow morning, hesitating out of shyness, a calm voice would say, please, sit down. Let's start with the smallest thing. The dawn of the future is sometimes just that, a toolbox open, a glass of lemonade, a swing seat still warm. Kindness, resilience, love. They don't find a path, they create one, step by step, so that those who come after can still see the way. Lydia, Mia, and Esteban's story is not just about a man stopping his truck in the scorching sun to save a mother and daughter, but a journey against prejudice, rumors, and even those in power lurking in the shadows, to ensure a child grows up in love and safety. Sometimes, to change a family's destiny, extraordinary strength isn't needed, just an open embrace, and the courage to say, they are not alone. None of us are born ready to face public scrutiny or confront those more powerful. But perhaps, what's important isn't winning immediately, but not backing down when we see injustice. What do you think about Esteban's choice that day? If it were you, would you stop your truck, reach out, or turn away? And if you, or someone you know, is being crushed by circumstances, remember, No one deserves to walk through the scorching sun alone. I'm here to listen. Truly.